While I was at PorkFest this year, I got a slight bump in subscribers. And whenever that happens, I'm always kind of curious as to what the cause is. And usually the best way to do that is to contact the new subscriber and say, hey, where did you find me? What led you to my channel? That sort of thing. And what really stood out is the several that I got during PorkFest were all from Sweden. And I realized there's just no statistically impossible, or very unlikely anyway, that I randomly got a sudden uptick in subscribers from Sweden. This is very likely posted in some kind of Swedish website or something. So I messaged the new subscribers, and sure enough, there is probably more than one, but there's several anarcho-capitalist Swedish Facebook pages, and my videos were posted on one of them. Apparently, some of my previous subscribers were from Sweden and got posted there, and of course, several of the people on the site went ahead and friended or subscribed to me, and then I ended up joining the Facebook group. It's a cool group. I think it's got about 70 to 80 people in it. They all seem like pretty principled. ANCAP, so the name of the group supposedly means something like Duck City or Duckburg, something like that in Swedish. And if you're a libertarian in the United States, you probably can understand why I would be interested in Sweden, or why libertarians in the United States would be interested in Sweden, because Sweden is probably, in most cases, most of the time, the most cited quintessential example of what the left in the United States wants. There's this kind of, but Sweden does it, Sweden works, Sweden is the city on the hill, Sweden is the country to emulate, if not perfectly, at least to move in that direction. It's the kind of seen as the thing that disproves libertarianism slash proves socialism or democracy or democratic socialism or whatever is trying to be pushed. And as such, it's really worthwhile then to kind of look at Sweden and several of the other Scandinavian countries. I mean, it's good to look at as many countries as possible, but in particular ones that are kind of cited as examples. Now, one of my actually more popular videos is about Scandinavian socialism in general. That's about the healthcare system generally. Um, I want to talk not about healthcare so much in this, but more generally about the system, and why I think that most of the comparative analysis that people make is on its face erroneous. Um, and I'd also like to say hello to my new Swedish subscribers. I know I picked up a couple. I have a couple subscribers from Scandinavia, and although it doesn't count as Scandinavia, I have quite a few from Finland. Again, I don't know how that happened. I don't know if I have many from Norway. I have a couple from Iceland, but that's mostly because I have a lot of friends in Iceland, and a couple from Denmark. So I always like when you guys chime in. But so the story, and then the other thing is, it's not just Americans that will say this. There will be people in Sweden or these other socialist Northern European countries, since Scandinavian, I guess, wouldn't necessarily include Finland, who say, yeah, our system's great. And so we have, well, American liberals say it's great. They say it's great. Where's the disagreement? I think the first thing to note is that to make what if someone in Sweden says they have the best system, and then somebody in Norway says that they have the best system, and that someone in Finland says they have the best system, can they all be correct? And the answer to that is obviously either all of them are wrong, or two of them are wrong, but they can't all be correct, because you can't have more than one best system. Uh, and what you notice when you debate people from other countries is that there's a very high correlation between people being from a country and asserting that that country has the perfect or the best, not perfect, because I don't want people to say that I'm strawmanning and saying utopian, although some people will couch it in those terms, but to say that their system is the best. Americans say this all the time. Canadians say this. Germans say this. Japanese people say this. Even people from Egypt are going to say this. Australians are going to say this. People very often, more so than can be explained by some kind of rational analysis or objective critique of or a comparison between different countries, pick their country as the best. And this is a clear indication that there probably is a bias that's skewing that assessment, because they literally all can't be the best. Um, only one of them can be optimal, and that's not necessarily even the optimal system. That's assuming that the optimal system is in place. I think that's very, very unlikely, actually, given the number of possibilities that exist. The idea that the optimal system has been implemented someplace is highly, highly suspect, just without even looking at the empirical tests. Just the idea that the ideal system has been created um, just seems highly unlikely, given the possibility. This also falls into the broader argument where people are like, oh, give me an example of anarcho-capitalism working, or true minarchism, or actual whatever. Um, Unless you are asserting that there is some optimal system already in existence, like literally in the context of this video, somebody is say, yeah, Sweden. I don't. Does anyone actually think that Sweden or Norway actually has a perfect system? A system that can't be improved upon anyway. Not necessarily utopia. And I don't think many people would claim to that. But then when they're going to come and say, oh, anarchy can't work because can you name, a perfect application of anarchy? No, I can't. And you can't name the perfect democratic socialist state. What's the most, because that's kind of a side tangent. I don't want to get into that too much, but right off the bat, it's clear then that people like to assert, for whatever reason, that their country is the best, and so it's not exactly compelling evidence when you have a lot of Swedes or Norwegian people, or Danes or Finns or Canadians or Americans for that matter. And if it comes right down to it in terms of pure democracy, Americans are going to outnumber all these other groups anyway. The number of Americans who think America has the best system is probably bigger than the entire population of any of the countries I just named. It's probably even bigger than the larger, more populated European states like the UK or Germany. I think Germany is the most populated state in the UK. Then again, the populations of China and India both dwarf the United States, and they probably have enough conservative nationalists in them to, if we were going to vote, I'm sure the system in the People's Republic of China would be voted as is the best system in the world. And I think people would realize that's probably not actually literally the case. Uh, and yet, when lots of people from Sweden say they like Sweden so much, people kind of accept that. The other thing, it is very common when you are debating people from other countries or debating people from the United States, they'll make these comparative analysis, say Sweden's better than the United States, and then they'll indicate that they don't know anything about one or the other system. So every time I've gotten in a debate and it turned out the person was a Swedish person, people who are lauding, hey, Sweden's way better than the United States, everything sucks in the United States, blah, 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 blah. Every time that I've had a debate like that, they ended up having almost no information about the U.S. system. The most common misapprehensions are that the government in the United States provides no welfare at all to anyone, ever, under any circumstances. That it provides no health care, there's no Social Security. And the other common misconceptions are that it's like people are just getting shot right and left all over the place, which is kind of on a different topic, but it demonstrates the sheer ignorance that happens. The U.S. government spends more on welfare than any European state on aggregate, and almost as much when you would look at it by proportion. Now, there are differences, certainly. Based on what I can understand of the Swedish system in particular, there seems to be a much stronger emphasis on egalitarianism. The idea is to make everybody equal. And though that rhetoric exists in the United States, and there are many people who speak in those terms, the primary, I think, emphasis, rationale, motivating political philosophy behind welfare in the United States isn't to create an egalitarian society, it's to help people who are in need. It's a safety net, the idea being, oh, someone's down on their luck, we're going to help them out until they can get better or whatever. Now, doesn't administrate it very well, ends up exacerbating the problem, not solving the problem, raises all kinds of other moral questions, but it is a slightly different motivation, and I actually think the motivation behind, assuming, for now ignoring the possibility of cynical use of the system for political gain, which obviously it happens, but the political philosophy behind welfarism in the United States is slightly less nonsensical than the egalitarian one in Sweden. Nonetheless, the idea that the United States doesn't provide any, any education, that's ridiculous. Obviously, K through 12 is free and more or less mandated. Beyond K, higher education is basically available to anyone who wants it, and anyone who can afford it. But the government will loan money to anybody who wants to go and as much as they need. And when I've told that, people from Sweden say you don't give any money for education. Like, that's ignoring K-12, and that's assuming that giving loans to people doesn't count as a subsidy. When of course it does. To be given such huge loans, and I mean, it's ridiculous. They'll give anybody loans and they'll give them huge amounts. To think that that's not a subsidy is absurd. The idea that they don't spend any money on healthcare, obviously, you've never heard of Medicaid, Medicare, or Social Security, and those are just the big three. There are lots of other ones. And so if you have a person who's going to say Sweden has a better system than the United States, and yet be completely ignorant about the situation in the United States, then their worth, their value as someone to compare and contrast is pretty much nil. They don't know what they're talking about, and we have a good reason to know why. And the same is true. Americans are like, Sweden's great, Sweden's great, Sweden's great. And then you start asking them, where's Sweden on the map? And they can't find it. What's the capital of Sweden? They don't know. What are the main political parties in Sweden? They don't know. How does the Swedish system operate? They don't know, they don't know, they don't know, and yet they know it's a better system. And not to say that every single person is that misinformed. I find that Europeans who are libertarian tend to know an awful lot about the United States, because most of the literature that's produced about libertarianism comes from the United States, and so it's all these American libertarians bitching about student loans and the Fed and the federal government and the drug war and all these other things. And so libertarians in Sweden or Germany or wherever tend to have a very well-informed opinion about many aspects of American society, less so on aspects that Americans don't talk about as much. So there are aspects of American society that libertarians aren't bitching about. European libertarians don't necessarily know that much about them, but they know more about it than the regular Swedes or Germans or UK people, for that, and Brits for that matter, who all they know is what their media tells them. Now, Michael Humer, in his lectures at Porkfest and in his book, says, in general, if the vast majority of people think something and you disagree with them, all things being equal, you're probably wrong. The chances that everyone else has systemically made a calculation error and you haven't is very unlikely in the vast majority of cases. And he even goes into some of the math, and it's like, if 80% of people think something's right, the chances that you are or think that one thing is the solution, if you think it's something else, then it's really almost infinitesimal that you are actually right and they're actually wrong. However, and Brian Kaplan actually kind of talks about this in his book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, too, a little bit. But that is with the stipulation of all things being equal. What if there's some kind of systemic bias within the population? Then all of a sudden, majority of opinions are basically worthless. They don't tell you anything. And we know that there are systemic biases in populations, demonstrably so. The first example I gave, when you have lots of people identifying their country as the best, well, it can't all be right. So we know that at the very least, everybody except for one country in the world, and probably not even there, are probably wrong about that. Now, in the case of governments tend to have an enormous amount of influence and incentive to control how people view the programs of that government. And so typically in Western democracies, they control education. They have a certain degree of control over the media, which, by the way, in Sweden is much greater. The control of the media in Sweden is much greater than the control of the media in the United States, as is the control of education. And it's just a fact that public schools in Sweden and the media in Sweden depict the government of Sweden and its programs in very flowery, nice terms. And I have noticed I know this much more in Canada, but I also have noticed in other countries that among Western democracies, one of the key elements in their propaganda war is to juxtapose their systems with the United States and use this as a way to both differentiate and to foster nationalism. So, you know, Sweden isn't some great world power. They don't have a big empire that they can tell their people, look, we have a big empire, the way the British used to be able to do, or the way the Americans can do it now. The Americans just love to say they're the most powerful country on earth. That's a huge boon to nationalism in the United States. They love to say it. And they love to say that we won World War II. You know, nations are going to pick what's going to, in their situation, engender the most, deference to authority in their systems. And in Sweden, you can't do that. Just as in Canada, you can't do that. So what do? There's lots of things you can do. I mean, they might be able to say, "Oh, we've had a monarchy for so long," or "We're really proud about this or that." Um, Sometimes this gets a little weird because they might pick some point in history and be really proud about that. So, oh, maybe we're not great now, but 800 years ago we were. That's a problem a lot of the Arab states have. Like, well, maybe things aren't so great now, but under the caliphate or whatever, things were better. Um, but what a lot of Western states like to do is say, oh, well, maybe we have problems, but at least we're not the United States. In Canada, it's just blatant. They are always juxtaposing Canada with the United States, even though the differences are becoming smaller and smaller. Canada has about as much free market economy as the United States, and its welfare programs, although certainly not identical, are similar in scope. If not in exact quality, there might be qualitatively slightly different. I mean, for instance, in Canada, it's against the law to buy your own health care, which is unusual even for countries with socialist universal health care. Um, but to pretend that the United States has a free market in healthcare is grossly ridiculous. And yet, the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, of course, a state-run Crown Corporation, the CBC is a Crown Corporation, which does not mean it's a free market, independent institution. Uh, Not to say that the major networks in the U.S. are. They're dependent on their oligopoly is dependent on the government giving them license to use the most um, the most the easiest to use bandwidths. The most economically valuable bandwidths are owned by the government, and then they divvy them out to the three networks, four now I guess. But you know other Western states like to say, oh well, we have free healthcare, or we have better welfare. We don't have poor people like they do in the U.S. And so they're kind of their flavor of nationalism is based, and this is especially difficult in Canada because Canada is essentially America's hat. It's the 51st state. It's politically dominated and ruled, and economically dominated and ruled by the United States. They have a huge identity crisis in that successful Canadians end up making their money and their fame in the United States. Um, I think the most um, emotional and obvious example would be just hockey players who are they're the pinnacle of social being in Canada, and how a high number of them end up playing for teams in the U.S., living in the United States, making their fame and fortune in the United States. Not necessarily becoming U.S. citizens, but very much working here. But the same goes for all levels, and so this causes a big problem in Canada where they have contests like who's the greatest Canadian, and oh, U.S. is fine, but they don't have universal health care. And if you just go around ask anyone on the street in Canada, why is Canada better than the United States, or what's the difference, they will say healthcare every time, I guarantee. Um, and the same thing is true in like Sweden. They're taught that they're egalitarian. The United States isn't, even though there's a lot of egalitarian rhetoric in the United States. Um, Now, another thing people will cite is kind of happiness surveys. Happiness surveys are just bullshit. All right, that's asking somebody how happy you are on a scale of 1 to 3, but there's no way to qualify that or quantify that. There's no metric. There's no happiness metric. Maybe there could be someday. Maybe it's not hypothetically impossible to figure that out, but there really isn't such a thing right now. And so this is uh, And the other thing is, there's a very strong amount of people's happiness is kind of venal in a way that it's based on how successful they feel that they are relative to their immediate peers. So even if there are people who are thousands of times richer than you are, if in your neighborhood you have the nicest house, you're going to be happy even if there are people 100 miles away who make more in a day than you make in a lifetime. Um, on the other hand, you could have a very high standard of living, but if you are middle income in your neighborhood, it's likely you aren't going to be quite as happy, um, or perceive yourself to be as happy. And so and the thing is the egalitarianism of these socialist states are pretty nebulous. If you look at the Gini indexes, which measure income, there is actually more income equality in someone like Sweden than there is in the United States. But when you look at the Gini for wealth, that's not the case. There's a huge wealth disparity. And what's the point then? I mean, let's just say all wages became fixed and everyone had the same wealth, income from now on. Well, the people who were rich would still be rich, and the people who would be poor would still be poor. And that would and that's assuming that the rich can't gerrymander their wealth in such a way as to not be paying any more, uh, or not pay higher taxes or whatever. So um, you know the when people try and use some kind of objective rubric to measure the equality, and again, I'm not sure why egalitarianism is the benchmark to measure success or whatnot. If people are really equal, then the world is boring and uninteresting. Variety is the spice of life, as they say. And unfortunately, in Sweden, this is actually kind of frowned upon. There's actually, right now, they're actually trying to eliminate gender identity by having preschoolers. They just invented a new pronoun that is gender neutral. So instead of boys and girls, he and she, it's. I don't know what it would be called. Uh, how does that make the world a better place? Unclear to me how that would be. Uh, you know, uh, it takes it for granted that egalitarianism is an end in itself, a worthwhile goal of society, but even more, how they measure it is really dubious. People will say, well, the UN says, Sweden's the best country or whatever. Well, the UN isn't some objective um, arbiter of truth. That's not to say I think everything the UN ever said is wrong, but they have their own goals that they work towards and their own biases, and then they grade accordingly. Um, and so I don't. And the same thing, much of the information about Sweden comes from Sweden, and when information comes from Sweden, it's coming from the Swedish state, and so it is going to reflect its own. It's going to show what the Swedish state wants to indicate. It's not going to be an objective analysis of its programs. It's going to be, this is their advertisement, basically. And people seem really have a hard time to understand that. Just like, what the stuff that the State Department puts out about the United States is not necessarily the truth. It's what the government wants to say. And it's not some paranoid conspiracy theory to say that. Even if they're not deliberately being dishonest, their biases are going to reflect their sincere assessment, and we can't just assume that their biases are correct or normative, which is kind of the implicit assumption in any argument that's going to assert that their claims are at face value something that we should take seriously. I mean, something we should look at just to see what they're saying or what they're trying to put out there, but then we have to weigh what they say against some kind of reasonable attempt to actually understand the issue. How happy are people really? If it's so great, why is the suicide rate so high? If it's so great, why do people move? Why is there immigration from Sweden if it's the paradise? Um, I'm not saying there's a huge amount of immigration from Sweden, because there isn't, but it actually has been increasing in the last couple of years. Why is that? And then there's another problem here I should have touched on before, the whole correlation causation thing. People say Sweden's happy, blah, 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 and it has socialism, hence socialism causes happiness. But Sweden, like all the other Western states, is a mixed economy. The United States is a mixed economy. Canada's a mixed economy. The UK, pretty much every country in the world is a mixed economy. You got a few countries that have explicitly tried to get away from any kind of capitalism. That would be like the North Koreas of the world and the Cubas of the world, and to a lesser extent, but larger in scale, the USSR and China, although in the past. And the experience has been when countries have literally tried to abolish the market, it has been the closest thing to suicide that societies have been able to muster. Um, Within the mixed economies, and then we have a very hard problem where we have to try and decide, what is the prosperity? How is that measured? And what is the cause? Is it from the fact that there's market activity, or is it because of government programs? And unfortunately, this requires a lot more analysis, a lot more a more serious look for theories, and a more honest and encompassing look at the data. And most people aren't willing to do that, and they're willing to just do a correlation equals causation fallacy, which they don't equally apply. And they say, well, Sweden is so much better than the United States because it has socialism. But unless you're a Swedish person who doesn't know anything about the United States, you should realize that the United States also has socialism. And so one could then say, well, isn't the socialism the cause of the problem in the United States? And, I mean, there needs to be more analysis there. Now, in terms of markets, Sweden and the United States are equally, are pretty much in the same area. There's not a big difference. If you look at the top 10 most free market countries in the world, it's a few of the Asian mini states, Hong Kong, Singapore, pretty much always. And then it's a list of the very pleasant Western democracies: Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, Ireland, Switzerland, and yes, the Nordic countries like Sweden or Finland. And again, they have a large amount of market activity. Sweden actually in the 1990s did a whole bunch of austerity. They actually cut back on government spending and taxes quite a bit because they were having a crisis. That they, I think, in an act of self-preservation, cut back on the role of government within society because, like any parasite, it was getting too big and threatening to kill the host, so to speak. Which is something the people in the United States who laud it so generously are usually unaware of. Uh, I mean, this is what's so frustrating about it, is you can make these claims and it's not a proof, but then they expect you to prove that they are wrong. Uh, and I think a lot more can be learned by like the more textbook scenarios where you have relatively similar states that in most respects are not that divergent in terms of their population or resources or previous histories, that have attempted to make diametrically opposed, like explicitly move away from the market. There's two outstanding examples: East and West Germany. Which, by the way, another reason I'm prompted by this is because there's a guy who's actually from the DDR, from East Germany, who's on my video about communism, and he's defending that. I mean, he thinks the DDR is better than the United States. That the people in the East Germany had it better than West Germans, had it better than Americans, had it as good as anyone's ever had. Um, which just goes to show is that people are not objective when they're talking about the nostalgia of their childhood. But you look at that, East and West Germany, and the other one obviously is North and South Korea, and there's just no comparison at all. That's not to say West Germany or South Korea are perfectly capitalist, because certainly they weren't and aren't. But there's such a radical difference between the two, and the main variable that's different is the communist versions explicitly moved as far away from the market as they could. Now, the socialists out there kind of have get out of jail free card where they can say they didn't achieve perfect socialism or whatever, and so they don't count, and socialism really would work if we had it, perfect socialism system instead of one that was corrupted by the party, because there's some way to guarantee that an all-powerful state will remain uncorrupted, because Lord Acton was wrong after all. Um, and then of course there are other examples like the United States and the USSR. USSR, larger, more resources, should be richer. It's got more capital accumulations. It's been doing it a lot longer than the United States. Plenty of smart people. The average IQ of a Russian is, I think, higher than the average IQ of an American, and yet really no comparison between the standard of living. So I think we have to account for why that is, and then maybe use the insight that we can garner from that when we're looking at, well, is Sweden rich because it has a welfare state or because it has a market economy and had the foresight not to fight in World War I or II? World War II is supposed to be good for the economy, but that's completely ridiculous. Why didn't Sweden have a huge depression? Like during the war years. That's actually an important reason right there. But yeah, so uh, and there's other things too. One story, I wish I could find the link to it, but um, these states that seem so nice, um, they have velvet gloves, but they're on iron fists. And when people react on the margins, and I'm not talking about someone being a criminal, I'm not talking about somebody who commits a crime and then the Swedish state tracks down them. I'm talking about people who are aberrant in the sense that they do what is not normal. They are persecuted in a way that is very revealing about the true nature of these states. I'm thinking now of a story I read about homeschooling. So homeschooling is legal in the United States. It varies by state to state, but it's actually pretty easy, and all the results are in empirically. Homeschoolers do better than public school children. It's cheaper and it's more effective. They are smarter, and people say, oh, they're getting religious indoctrination. That's true, but who cares? They're doing better on the standardized tests that supposedly measure how good public schools are. So by the state's own rubrics, they're better. And in Sweden, I think this may have actually recently changed, but it was permitted, but it was not widely practiced, and it was very, very heavily regulated. Well, there is a family, and the father was actually in the foreign service, and he was going to get posted to India or something, and they were going to move in like 6 months. And since they were going to move, he knew that their 5-year-old son was not really going to be able to attend. He's not going to be able to finish the year in whatever school he was enrolled in. And they decided that they wanted to teach him how to speak the language in wherever they were going, one of the Indian languages. And so they came up with the idea of, okay, well, he's not even going to be in school the whole time. We'll homeschool him, do the regular curriculum, and we'll start teaching him whatever language he's going to be taught where he's going to end up growing up for the next couple of years. And in Sweden at the time, it required the permission of the principal of whatever local school you would otherwise be attending. And they sought this permission, and to the best of their knowledge, they received it. So they started homeschooling their kid. It sounds like there's either a misunderstanding, or the principal or some other bureaucrat in the Swedish system decided that this was actually a bad idea and that this should not be permitted. And they lost custody of their child. The state came and took the child away, and then they've been fighting for custody for months. Well, I read the article. I think it was more than a year, near a year, since it happened. I'm kind of curious how this story ended up, and what they would go through. I mean, here's what they would do then. Then, as they're fighting for custody, the family wanted to see the child, and the social workers basically told them, when you see the child, you need to tell them that you are happy that he is not in your care, and that you are happy that he is in the care of the state. You can't come and tell them that you're trying to get him back or that you don't like the situation. You need to lie to him and tell him that you're happy with the situation and that it's good that he's not in their care. Now, why there'd be that level of sadism, I don't know. But if Sweden is some nice, happy country, then that should not be happening. And that's just, and it wasn't like they committed a crime. They were planning to homeschool, and they thought that they actually had satisfied the system to do so. But you see, the Swedish system is based on the state ownership of everything, of conformity to societal norms. to the point that any aberrant activity is squashed, is treated as and this is a country that treats criminals of actual crimes very, very well. Oh, you have rights, and you have nice prisons, and blah, blah, blah. And then this. And it's not just this, it's free speech even. Something, I always, people go, oh, Sweden, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, Sweden doesn't have free speech. Are we supposed to emulate that also? Or freedom of religion. They don't have that either. Never mind gun rights, which actually gun rights aren't so bad in Sweden relative to, say, the UK, but they aren't as good as they are in the United States by a long shot. Not that that would be convincing to many liberals. So, they're kind of advocating this whole system, but without saying, well, parts of the system they wouldn't want to keep, or they would want to keep. There's no differentiation between what's good and what's not good. It's what feels good, what sounds good to what is usually an uncritical ear, an uninformed, ignorant ear that doesn't really know what it's actually talking about, as is so often the case when people are talking about politics. To a point, for the average Joe, I think that's rational ignorance. But when you have people who are politicos, who are going around, advocating this or that system, I think it's kind of inexcusable for them to have these strong opinions. It's interesting how little opinions correlate with actual knowledge or wisdom or anything. Strong opinions, Sweden this, Norway that, Canada, Canada, and then, well, what's how do those systems actually work? Oh, I don't really know. They're just democratic. You just call anything democratic, it automatically makes it a good idea, apparently. So, and then, well, Swedish people think that they have it perfect, except for the ones who know anything about the United States. They're libertarians, and they, don't want Sweden the way it is. And the ones who do, they don't know shit. Just like Americans who want to be like Sweden don't know shit. So, I guess this is. I'm going to talk to the Swedish guys a lot more, I think, over the next couple years, months or whatever, just to get a better idea of exactly how their system operates. From what I can tell, there's a very much an upper class. The super elite have a different life, and then everyone else has this monotonous. It's okay, but it's not like poverty, but it's like you can't really advance. There's no chance for betterment. It's a society that's ossified in a certain state, and since the world is not self-ossified, since it's always changing, it ultimately is not a dynamic system. It's one that's doomed to failure. Even if the government had things perfectly calibrated, which again is logically very unlikely, when the situation changes, that calibration would have to change with it, and it's very unlikely to do so, very well. And so it's going to be, even if it's spot on at one point, it's going to become progressively less spot on as time goes. And of course, it's probably not spot on anyway. So, all right, I think that's it.